I have known Hwa Yung for a really long time, and it's just a real honor and a privilege to be introduce Hwa Yung. Hwa Yung is Bishop Emeritus of the Methodist Church in Malaysia, where he served from 2004 to 2012. Before that, he served as a pastor and seminary lecturer and principal. He was a member of the OCMS Council from 1999 to 2015, and for some years served as the chair. He has been actively involved in the Lausanne movement for many years, including being part of the executive management team for Cape Town 2010, and for some years, a member of the international board. His writings are largely in the fields of contextual theology and mission, and though officially retired, he maintains an active ministry of preaching and writing. The other thing is he's either a really good or a really bad headhunter. Because, rather than complaining about the leadership of OCMS, all you have to do is throw a rock at Hwa Yung, because whether it's Wan Suk Ma, Tom Harvey, or Paul Bender Samuel, he's the person to blame in terms of what's going on. But it's a real honor and a privilege to introduce you, Hwa Yung, and go ahead and begin your lecture, and we'll go up until around 3 p.m. We can go a little bit over, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Are you going to lead us in prayer?
Yes, let's open up in prayer. Dear Lord, I do pray for Hwa Yung, and I thank you for the gifts that he has given the church, that he has given to mission, and that he has given to the establishment of your kingdom globally. Lord, I just pray for this session this afternoon that you will honor it and glorify it so that your glory might be all the more manifest. We thank you for all that you have provided for this day, and all that you're going to be providing for the years to come in work and in mission. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right, friends, it's so wonderful to be here, to be able to come and share with you. I'm very deeply honored. I'm no longer in academic research, as most of you know, and trying to find time to do some writing and took me about 3 weeks to get these lectures ready, in between all my other things. So it does take a bit of time, but it's good to be able to be with you. Now, before I go on, I'm going to see what I'm going to do, see how I'm going to get the share screen thing on, okay? Just give me a second.
There you go, good sharing.
Right, I'm going to make sure that
yeah, put it on presentation mode.
Right, that's fine.
There we go.
Okay. All right, friends. Hang on, just give me a second. All right, friends, thank you very much for having me once again. I titled this lecture, Will Lausanne Evangelicals Post-Cape Town 2010 Repeat Edinburgh's 1910's Mistake? I did it partly provocatively, but also seriously. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just begin with a brief overview of what I'm going to do for this lecture, and to explain how I came into this whole discussion in my own life. Secondly, I will want to go back and look at Edinburgh 1910, and some of the issues and challenges, key challenges faced. Then I want to look at what happened between Edinburgh 1910 and how it led all the events led up to Lausanne 1974. Then I'll briefly look quickly at Cape Town 2010, and then finally come to the question to answer. Because I had to do all these things to set the background for the question that I would like to answer. So that's how the lecture will go. Okay. All of you who are in the missiology field knows that there are a lot of issues to be discussed, especially in terms of theological details about Edinburgh 1910 and Cape Town 2010. There's no time for us to cover all these things, so I'm just going to look at the broad trends. The other thing is that I use the term Lausanne Evangelicals in a broad sense. I'm not directing this, the point of what I'm going to say, necessarily at the Lausanne board as it exists today. I'm not directing it at the study groups as such, or the staff that's working therein. I'm using the term Lausanne Evangelicals in a broad sense. Those who identify with the Protestant evangelical traditions and are comfortable with the broad position laid down by the Cape Town, by the Lausanne Covenant, the Manila Manifesto, and the Cape Town Commitment. I'm also including those who are coming out of WEAA and all the affiliates. I'm also including those who are from the indigenous church backgrounds in many parts of the majority world. Some of you prefer to use the term Global South, who would happily identify with the Lausanne Covenant, etc., and who also affirm the authority of the scriptures and are in broad agreement with Lausanne theology. Including among these will also be Pentecostals and Charismatics, some of whom who hardly know anything about Lausanne. I actually met a group in Cape Town who actually are not, who are saying that many of our Pentecostals are left out. I'll come back to that in a moment. First, my own personal journey. My first introduction to the issues in relationship to the theological discussions was in my growing up years in my teens, in the 1960s, in the Methodist Church in Malaysia. We were planted by, the Methodist Church in Malaysia was a plant of the United Methodist Church. So by the time of by the 1960s, we were influenced by sort of moderate, type of liberal theology. Conversions were welcome, evangelism was talked about, but really it was largely focused on, a lot of it was focused on the social gospel. I only became conscious of some of the big issues when I went to university in Australia under the influence of the Australian FES or the IFES or the InterVarsity, depending where you come from. And as I grew deeper in my understanding of theology and also the Bible's message, I began to understand some of the issues. And then by the time you came to the late 60s and 70s, you begin to hear of the big debates that was taking place at the international level on the more liberal exponents were people representatives of the WCC, and then the more conservative voices were people like okay, let me come back. The more liberal voices were the people like Johannes, sorry, there's a spelling error. Johannes Hockendijk as one of them, WCC and its Commission for World Mission and Evangelism. And then the more conservative voices were people like Donald McGavran, Arthur Glasser of Fuller, Peter Byerhouse of Tübingen. The WCC and its Commission on World Mission and Evangelism were pushing for a more liberal and humanistic view of mission, which exerted that humanization here, basically defined as the betterment and enrichment of human life in the here and now. They were pushing for a view of the goal of missions, humanization as being the goal of mission instead of evangelization. And these debates were all centered around some of these words. And broadly speaking, it was out of this background that Lausanne emerged. But to give you an idea of how some of these debates went, I was working on a thesis on the World Council of Churches theology, doing my Master of Theology on the World Council of WCC's theology of mission. And when I came to look at, for example, the CWME conference in Bangkok in 1972 and 73, here I'm quoting direct from the documents, okay? On the preparatory documents, the idea that Jesus, how did they understood Jesus as Savior? Well, quote, in Latin America, many young people begin to see that Che Guevara, the guerrilla leader who was killed in Bolivia, and Jesus Christ belong to the same tradition. Now here is quoting from documents, actually, produced by the CWME. Another one was they even go for a more daring comparison, comparing Mao Zedong, the communist leader of China, with Jesus Christ as both as saviors. Now, these are actually from documents. I'm not putting words in people's mouth, right? And at that time, people like Johannes Huckendijk was very, very influential. And as one author puts it, David Bosch put it, he says, by the time you came to this point, really says Uppsala 1968 and Bangkok 1972, the distinction between the church and the world was basically removed for all intents and purpose. In the final report of the CWME conference, you actually, how do you define salvation? One definition of salvation was talking about somebody who's been liberated from oppression, quote, you were oppressed and fled to the liberated areas and dedicated your life to the revolutionary struggle. In other words, if you were liberated from political oppression and dedicate your life to liberation struggles, you have known salvation. And perhaps the most jarring statement that was made was, here again a quote, you found all the traditional language meaningless and became an atheist by the grace of God. Now, this is direct from the documents of the CWME. And of course, it was against this background that people like Donald McGavran, probably those of you who are familiar with that period will know that Donald McGavran wrote 2 articles, one just before Uppsala, and he says, will Uppsala betray the 2 billion? That time, the world population was about 3-point-something billion, and about more than 2 billion were not yet Christians. So McGavran says, does it mean that we stop preaching the gospel? Will Uppsala betray the 2 billion? And then by the time, 4 years later, by the time you came to the CWME conference, McGavran, in an article in Christianity Today, actually says, yes, Uppsala betrayed the 2 billion. So now what? It was against this background that Lausanne was born. And here I think you need to hear from the horse's own mouth. This is a direct quote from Billy Graham himself in his autobiography. He says that he was talking about Lausanne. He was saying that he was concerned as they got ready to get Lausanne going, was that the World Council of Churches agenda was focused on, here is a quote, on social and political justice to the exclusion of the redemptive heart of the gospel to a lost world. Implicit in much of this discussion was the assumption that Christ had already been given salvation, Christ had already given salvation to everyone. In other words, a belief in universalism, so that there's no need for humans to repent or believe in Christ in order to be saved. Such a view not only cut the nerve of evangelism, it also rejected the clear teaching of Scripture. This trend alarmed evangelicals who found themselves grasping for a more thorough understanding of a biblical theology of evangelism. Now, this was the direct background to Lausanne 74, and as we know that this paved the way. This paved the way for this started the whole Lausanne movement going. I think Lausanne 74 had some serious fruits. One, it unified evangelicals and gave the whole movement a clear direction. Before that, the evangelicals in the world tended to be rather everybody did their own thing. It reaffirmed the centrality of the biblical faith in mission theology. And it also was a turning point from the earlier fundamentalism, which focused only on preaching the gospel, to the beginnings of the development of a more holistic theology. That will more of that later. In any case, the above paved the way for Lausanne, Lausanne 74, and then Manila 89, and then Cape Town 2010. And at Cape Town in 2010, which a number of you were present, we can say that what we can celebrate there was the largest global Christian conference in the 21st century, 4,200 people, plus another 200 who could not come from China. So if you included that figure, you're talking about 4,004 participants from 98 nations, 65% or thereabouts. We're still never quite sure the figures because of the difficulty of counting on this one. About 65% or thereabouts were from the majority world or global south. Tens of thousands participated online through our global link at 600 registered remote sites in 90 countries. It claims, probably to some extent true, the most representative global conference ever in history, representing numerous tongues and nations. And finally, Cape Town 2010 had a better claim to be the true spiritual heir of Edinburgh 1910. You see, at the time, same time, there was they were running the Edinburgh 2010. In fact, Ken Ross, who ran Edinburgh 2010 in a private discussion, said to Doug Birdsall, he says, look, Cape Town is the spiritual heir of Edinburgh 1910. So I think that's a fair statement. Okay, the question therefore we ask is, why was it, as we think about it, what happened? Now, Edinburgh started as a World Missionary Conference. Why did the mission emphasis on Edinburgh 1910 finally crash somewhere in the 1960s and 70s? And the question that I want to put to us is, will Cape Town 2010 make the same mistakes? So let's move on to look at Edinburgh 1910. Edinburgh 1910 was a conference that was, the details have been well documented, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with Brian Stanley's book, published in 2009 on Edinburgh, the World Missionary Conference 1910. And the details are well documented, and if you want more details, that's a book to look at. It was not the first international missionary conference, right? But it was actually the fourth. But it surpassed the others in a meticulous manner in which the preparation was done and what it accomplished. More than 1,215 official delegates, roughly, with almost there, but with only, at the latest count, apparently, only 20 from the majority world or the emerging churches, from non-Western churches. 1,215 altogether, but 20 only from the majority world. Compared with Cape Town, we had 65%. All right. Also, it did not, as many of you know, include, for reasons of which we won't spend time on, did not include any missionaries working in Latin America. The denominational representation was overwhelmingly Protestant, no Catholics, no Orthodox or Oriental or indigenous churches from the non-Western world, right? There was a small number, a small number from the Society for Propagation of the Gospel, the Anglo-Catholic group. Okay. The result of the conference, I think many saw it as highly successful. A lot of excellent discussions ensue, and in the minds of the most, it was highly successful. And one result that needs noting was that it gave a tremendous impetus to the ecumenical movement that followed. Now, those of you who have studied Edinburgh 1910 will know that it was called out of a concern by the missionary societies working all over the non-Western world, who says, look, if we're going to be effective in mission, we've got to cooperate. So in the mission field, they cooperated. But if we are cooperating in the mission field, why can't we cooperate at home? So it was partly that which drove the concern for the ecumenical movement, the unity of the churches at home in the Western world. But this concern for unity eventually displaced the mission agenda. And the unity at Edinburgh 1910 was achieved through a compromise or a prize, right? And that prize people thought was not important at that point. It was a small compromise in order to make sure that the Anglo-Catholics would participate in a conference. But it turned out that it was a very heavy price to pay, because we'll look at that in more detail now. Soon, because there was no discussion on doctrine and polity, Edinburgh did not avoid all discussions on doctrine and church polity. Consequently, the whole mission movement that resulted from that, eventually forming the IMC, the International Missionary Conference, was such that there was no clear doctrinal stand taken. In other words, theologically, the whole mission movement was set adrift. We'll come to that in a moment. Now, what followed after 1910 was this. A few years, the Commission 8 asked for the continuation committee to be formed. And this eventually led to the formation of what's called the International Missionary Council in 1910. And the International Council continued to meet from the International Mission Council was formed in 1921. And for 40 years later, in 1961, it officially combined together World Council of Churches, and it became the one wing of the World Council of Churches. But what happened was this: soon, in a few years after Edinburgh 1910, although there was tremendous unity because those who were there were broadly all evangelicals, right? But soon, the divergences begin to show up in the next few decades. For example, I'm just giving you two examples to illustrate this. The CIM, the China Inland Mission, now OMF International, was intimately involved in the preparation of Edinburgh 1910. In fact, 3 of the people of its officers were part of the commissions, members of the commission. But by 1926, it effectively had withdrawn from the IMC. And that was only 15 years later. All right. Now, in the case of US mission, the percentage of the American missionaries related to the National Council of Churches the National Council of Churches of Christ, the ecumenical group, which is the link with the WCC. By 1957, you had 42% of American missionaries were, okay, of the American missionaries that sent out, 42% were linked with the National Council of Churches. By 1969, the number declined to 28%. By 1975, it was only 14%. In other words, the American missionary societies, many of them were slowly withdrawing themselves from the IMC or the World Council of Churches, okay, the related body. Now, so these were the divergences being shown up with the decades. Now, a lot of the divergences center around the theology. Perhaps one of the most hotly debated issue was how you understand Missio Dei. I think the Missio Dei, not Mission Day. The mission of God. I think it was a term coined by Karl Barth, if I'm not wrong. But there were basically 2 interpretations. The traditional view that all of us evangelicals would say that God redeems the church, and through the church reaches out to the world. But people like Johannes Huckendijk, Harvey Cox, and others who are making big contributions in the 50s and 60s to the discussion were saying, no. God works through the world. And where God is at work in the world, there is the church. So there's no, now when you look at this, the difference in interpretation, you need to understand the difference in if you say that God works through a church and through a church reaches out to the world, you have a broad, clear boundary between the church and the world. The church reaches out to the world, and those who confess Jesus Christ becomes part of the church. But when you take this second formulation, God, world, church, then you're saying that God works in the world, and anywhere you see the world, God at work, you see the church. There's no clear line. There's no clear boundary. And so if you had read the World Council of Churches documents and the debates surrounding it, you find that what they're saying is this: oh, there's a revolution in China under Mao Zedong. There is salvation. There's the church. Mao Zedong would be a sort of representing God's salvation, or wherever that. So there was no clear distinction between the world and the church. So this is where it left theology in a complete set theology completely adrift. There was nothing firm. There was no anchor, and this, of course, created a strong reaction on the part of the evangelicals, and that was the reason why many evangelical groups and mission society began to pull out. Now, so what do we have in the pre-Lausanne 1974 situation? Yeah, a number of things: theology, Western influence, mission being sidelined after the IMC merger with WCC. Let me just go through this in a bit more detail. Theology. In Edinburgh, 1910 avoided all discussion on doctrine in order to accommodate the Anglo-Catholics. In so doing, it failed to address the incipient influence of German liberal theology and also the beginning of the growth of American social gospel. Thus, there was no clear theological frame of reference for the missionary movement to work within after Edinburgh 1910. And without an anchor rooted in the Bible's authority, the missionary movement was set adrift theologically. In other words, any group that claims to be Christian, irrespective of its commitment to authority of scriptures, irrespective of its commitment to the classical Christian beliefs, can become part of the missionary movement. The costly mistake of not dealing with the doctrine of Edinburgh 1910 gradually dawned upon the evangelicals at large in the following decades of the 20th century. So WCC's theology was moving in a direction that was marked by four things: a rejection of personal conversion and faith in Christ as central, which Billy Graham noted; universalism and religious pluralism. They were not just pushing for universalism, that all are saved, but they were also saying, basically, you read some of the documents, was saying that all religions are basically moving in the same direction. It was universalism together with religious pluralism. And thirdly, humanization, not evangelization, was the goal of missions. Fourthly, the boundary between the church and the world was blurred. Now, I don't know about you who live in the Western world, how it impacted you. But for many of us who are living in Asia and Africa, that left the church in tremendous confusion. Many of our church leaders did not know where they were going. They were talking about Christian faith, but they were not sure of conversion. They were talking about proclaiming the gospel. Yeah, but at the same time, they were all influenced by religious pluralism. And in the seminaries, we had a lot of difficulties at a point. And that is where we were. So that was the first problem. Theology was set adrift. Secondly, I think, although some people might debate it, I think the Western influence, especially the liberal side, was predominant. The agenda was largely driven from the West by mainline churches through money and personnel. The money behind the World Council of Churches and the CWME was largely provided by the West, especially Germany and US. Apparently, in one of Mark Lang's papers, he pointed out that something like before the 1980s or 90s, when Chancellor Kohl did some tax reform in Germany, 80% of World Council of Churches money came out of German churches. It's a huge sum of money. And America provided the rest, I think, basically. So it was driven by Western money. Secondly, despite the fact that staffing in the World Council of Churches included significant numbers from the non-Western world, many of these were actually trained doing their PhDs and so forth in Western mainline seminaries at the universities, and therefore ending up espouse a more liberal theology that they had imbibed in their student days. So consequently, you find that it was driven to a large extent from a Western liberal theology. And some of the key spokesmen were all coming from that background. The third thing was mission became sidelined after IMC's merger with the World Council of Churches. Theologically, mission had already been set. The IMC, which became the CWME. Theologically, the mission movement within WCC, ecumenical mission movement, had already been set adrift. Organizationally and financially, it was being marginalized within the WCC itself. It became only one of 16 or 17 departments in the whole WCC. At the 5th WCC World Assembly in Nairobi, 1975, Bishop Arias of the Evangelical Methodist Church in Bolivia was asked to give the
Singaporean accent.
Sorry. It's some interruption. Somebody, Tom, I think somebody is speaking.
No, I muted him. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. At the 5th World Council of Churches World Assembly in Nairobi, Bishop Arias of the Evangelical Methodist Church of Bolivia was asked to give the plenary address on the theme that the world may believe. He began by reminding the World Council of Churches of its missionary origins and therefore, quote, the intention to stay together, which is the basis of WCC, the basis of the WCC, is secondary to the indispensable task of the Church of Christ, the evangelization of the world. Then he goes on to exert that the WCC has not been faithful to its missionary roots and to the primary task of the church, and indeed has treated evangelism as the Cinderella of the WCC, where it figures as nothing more than one office with a single occupant. Now that's quite a strong, damning conclusion, statement, but I'll leave that to you. But that's where WCC was. So in the pre-Lausanne 74 situation in WCC, theology was adrift, Western influence was predominant, mission was increasingly sidelined in the World Council of Churches. And so this brought us to Lausanne, and then to Manila, and finally to Cape Town. Now I already mentioned briefly where people felt that Cape Town 2010 was seen as something that we could celebrate together. So I will not go over that again. But what I can simply add is this, that it had a global impact among evangelicals as a whole. It was inspirational. And you can still see, for those of you who are not familiar with it, you can still see quite a lot of this through videos on the website, the Lausanne website. So you can go there. Now, for your information, even the China delegates who could not come were impacted. You find that it was Cape Town that brought many of the networks together. David Rowe and others did a lot of good work. And there were follow-up conferences outside China after Cape Town, even though they could not come to Cape Town. So it actually benefited even China. And the Cape Town commitment itself continues to be a reference by many as a guide for theology and ministry. Many contributed towards Cape Town 2010. And I'm happy to say to you that on the part of those of us who are on the executive leadership team, we felt that Doug Birdsall, who's one of OCMS graduates, should actually get the prize for being the best player or the most valuable player. So you can tell him that when you see him. All right. But there were also critical comments. For example, René Padilla did a paper, and he made the first 3 comments. He said that the way the program was planned, and he singled out one presentation which I won't mention. He says there seems to still appear to be a dichotomy between evangelism and social responsibility. The idea of integral mission, which has been discussed for so long, seems to not to be central. Secondly, he also made the comment, which Rosemary Downs is sitting here, so I think you also made the comment, there was no time to discuss the Cape Town commitment draft because it was given up only the night before the conference finished. Third thing, he also made the comment that he said that the presentation on strategy for evangelization in this generation reflects the market mentality of American evangelism. Now, I'll come back to some of these issues in more detail towards the last part of my lecture. Well, dear Stoinago from Brazil, in his comments, he says, Latin Americans felt an underrepresentation because he says, Latin Americans have seen the church grow. Amazingly, he said from 1974, the first Lausanne Conference, to 2010, 40 million have been added to the Pentecostal churches. And yet that voice was totally not represented. In fact, I met a group of Pentecostal leaders sitting in Cape Town, and they made exactly the same comment. They say many of us are not, our agenda is not being discussed, etc. And many of us are also not linked to Lausanne. So while dear Stoinago was actually making a comment that even the delegates at Cape Town itself made. And then I think Rosemary Dowsett, who's sitting here, also you made the comment that the professionalism and the rigid time control leave little space for the Holy Spirit. I want to add two more comments on my own. I think that was a failure to address the whole realm of the supernatural. When you read documents about the growth of the church in the majority world in the last 100 years, for example, I can read a book, I can quote a book to you where the writer says, look, we from China, he says, we in China in the 70s and 80s, 80% of those of us who came to Christ experienced the supernatural. And yet this whole area was not discussed in any detail. And the other comment I would like to make is that the whole treatment of world religions was very, very weak. I think what you have to recognize is this, that it's strange because people talk a lot. There was a lot of talk about the 24th, the 1040 window, and he said these are where the most unreached people are living. And yet, if you look at the so-called 1040 window, and you a little bit outside it, you find what is that the reason why they're unreached is because many of these people are living in literate cultures, or at least their leaders have a literate culture. And where these major world religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Chinese philosophical thought, Shintoism, all this, right? They had lived with it for 2,000 and more years. You cannot expect to reach these people in the same way that you reach people living in a modern Western secular culture. There's an urgent need to develop appropriate contextual means of reaching those in such cultures. And this covers the question of what evangelistic approaches we take. How does worship and music take place? Apologetics. We don't have serious apologetics directed at each of these religions, work out in detail. The theology, all the theology textbooks that we use, Tom, you were in Singapore, the systematic theology books are all written from the West. It doesn't address the context of world religions, right? And other matters that were rooted in in-depth studies, and other matters that are rooted in in-depth studies and understanding of the respective religions and cultures. So as we think about moving into the future, and this brings me to the major part of my talk. I'm sorry, it's been a very extended introduction. Which way will Lausanne Evangelicals go post 2010? I think if you look at what happened in 2010, there are basically two ways of looking at it. And I suspect both will be there. The first paradigm, Cape Town 2010, is a celebration of the growth of the global evangelical church by the grace of God over the past 100+ years since Edinburgh 1910. And a challenge to seek the Lord further for his leading as we move into the future together. That's the first one paradigm. A second paradigm is Cape Town 2010 is a powerful symbol of the triumph of evangelical Christianity over an anemic and dying liberalism, especially of Western evangelical mission movement over the liberal version as represented by WCC. Now, to be honest, and I stand corrected, and I'm open for full discussion on this afterwards. I think both paradigms were there at Cape Town. But my question is, and I think the question that we have to address is, which will become the controlling paradigm as we move forward? I think that is the key question that we have to answer. I want to say this. If we choose paradigm 2, as some people no doubt would, it would be very unwise. It would be a very unwise choice. And I'm going to give you the reasons why I think it's a very unwise choice, right? To think of it as primarily a triumph of Western evangelical Christianity over anemic liberalism in the West. I want to suggest 5 reasons. Okay. First is, sorry, let me go back. If we choose second paradigm, paradigm 2, then what we'll do is this, to say, okay, if that's the case and mission advance on the basis of this, then what we have to do is to double down on what we have done. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Okay, give me a moment. I want to get back to full screen. Okay, if we were to choose paradigm 2, right, what will happen is this, that if we choose this, then what we would do is to say that, well, that means we have been doing right. And if we've been doing right, then we just have to, since from Edinburgh 1910 to Cape Town 2010, we've been doing the right thing. Therefore, what we need to do is to double down on what we have done and to do more of it, right? And to do more of it. I want to suggest that this would be a very dangerous and foolish assumption, decision to make, because I want to suggest that paradigm 2 rests on certain problematic assumptions. And let me go through them. First, the first question is, has evangelicalism triumphed over an anemic liberalism in the West? Sure, in some ways it has. When I was doing theology in the 1970s, a majority of the scholarly influential theological writings were largely by the non-evangelical scholars, with evangelical scholarship often being scoffed at within academic theological circles. But that has been dramatically turned around in the last couple of decades. I still remember some years ago, J.I. Packer saying, we have finally outthought the liberals, which is true. But unfortunately, I want to suggest that while we are fighting the liberals, without realizing it was both evangelicals and liberals, we were fighting. Both the evangelicals and the liberals were outflanked by the secularists and had become marginalized by them. And I think that's what happened in much of the West today. That's the first point. Secondly, if you think that for mission to be effective in the coming decades, we continue to push the Western agenda, it fails to see that the best day of Western evangelicalism, as measured by the revivals of the 18th and 19th century and the great missionary movement of the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, I think those days are over in the West, in a sense. Present-day evangelicalism is a crippled version of what was in the past. I was at a conference where, a private conference, Doug Birdsall invited us to talk about in 2018 about the problem of Donald Trump and how a majority of evangelicals seem to be supporting him. And Mark Leberton, President of Fuller, actually made this comment at a meeting. As President of Fuller, he says, on the evangelical support of Trump, he said, the central crisis facing us, he's talking about evangelicalism in North America, is that the gospel of Jesus Christ has been betrayed and shamed by an evangelicalism that has violated its own moral and spiritual integrity. The crisis is caused by the way a toxic evangelicalism has turned the gospel into good news. Sorry, the gospel of good news into The crisis is caused by the way a toxic evangelicalism has turned the gospel into good news that is fake. That sums it up in a very neat way. Thirdly, as an external observer, not being from the West, but having lived there and worked to some extent, I fear the recovery of evangelicalism's past great spiritual greatness in the West will not be easy, given the deep spiritual and moral weakness within and intense secularist pressure without. I'll give two examples. I see evangelicals fighting very hard in America over the LGBT issue. And in my conversations with them, I say, look, I don't think you can win this battle, simply because you already cut the ground from your own feet in the whole issue over divorce and remarriage. In relation divorce and remarriage, you've already given up the biblical ethical standards. Why should people take you seriously when you want to insist on biblical standards on the LGBT issue? We cannot have the cake and eat it. I'll give you a second example where I see the weaknesses. I was involved indirectly in the selection of a CEO for a major international Christian evangelical organization. And there were some questions about whether one of the shortlisted candidates was being firm on the LGBT issue. And finally, when pressed, why is it that his own church had accepted a ruling and supported a ruling in his own church council, a broader church council, on accepting the fact that his church can choose to bless or not to bless the same-sex marriage? His answer was this. He said, in our country, the government has already passed a law that same-sex marriage must be allowed. If we did not pass it, we'll be guilty. We'll be doing something against the law. I thought about it. I said, goodness gracious me. Tell that to the Christians in China. Tell that to Christians living in Islamic land and ask them what they think about that argument. Will evangelicals in the West be willing to pay the price of costly discipleship? The recovery of evangelicalism's past greatness in the West will not be easy. Fourthly, Western evangelicalism is often unaware that it's no longer the dominant center of the evangelical world that it once was. Many are aware of Andrew Ward's statement, and so I'm sure he might have even made it in OCMS. He said, you go to study in any major university in the world. You study Africa. You cannot study Africa without studying how the church have grown in Africa. But you go to all our major theology departments, they study theology as if Africa is unimportant. Western theological writers and teachers doesn't understand what's going on outside the West. And that's a point that Andrew Walsh makes. And some of you will also say that what Western scholars don't realize is that Western theology, framed as it is actually a very contextual theology shaped by the Enlightenment. Some of you will also know Paul Joshua, who died some years ago because of kidney problem, I think, and some of you know me personally. He also draws attention to the fact that when Western scholars write about evangelicalism, they hardly ever engage, if they even mention it all, theology that's written outside the West. But I want to say something more. Those of you who are from the majority who are Global South, you know this. Every one of us from the non-Western world have at some point or other had some unpleasant experience from some Western church leaders who come across assuming the superiority of Western Christianity. One of the latest example was told to me by somebody who finished his PhD partly through OCMS. I won't mention name again. He said, I was finishing my PhD writing up. I went to Tyndale House to spend a few months to do research. I arrived there, one of the men I met was a big name pastor, one of our Cape Town speakers, incidentally, no names mentioned. And he came to me and said, what are you doing? He said, I'm writing my PhD thesis on Paul. The next question he asked is, are you for or against anti-rights view of new perspective on Paul? The next thing was, what are you writing? He said, I'm writing on suffering. Then he looked at him and says, are you going to finish your thesis and put it on a shelf and get on with other things? And my friend looked at this man who had come across so condescendingly. He says, I come from a Muslim country. I know what suffering means. End of conversation. And my friend said to me, for the rest of the whole of the next month, he never bothered to talk to me or greet me. Was it an assumed superiority that he had? Or was it because he didn't like being told off, that he knew nothing about what he was talking about when he talks about suffering? But that's the sort of experience, unfortunately, comes across. And I'm sorry to my Western friends if I'm not being personal, but I'm just letting you know what's happening. I think Western evangelicalism has got to recognize it's no longer at the center. And I think we have to move forward on that basis. My last comment is probably the most telling. There's a failure to recognize that the real impetus behind the growth of Christianity in the majority world, the global South, is not what the Western Church and Western mission agencies think they are. You see, much of modern missions agency, and by the way, it's not just Western. You find that the new mission agencies developing from my country, from Singapore, from Hong Kong, from Korea, also follow the West in many of this. Much of the modern missions enterprise have been driven by the assumption that what is needed for kingdom advance is adequate human resources, proper academic training, strategic planning, and of course, most important, money. Now, this is what probably Samuel Escobar mean when talk about managerial missiology. But what most people, including, as I say, most of us in our global South or the majority world, whether it's Asia, Africa, Latin America, oftentimes we still unthinkingly think that these are what drive missions. And yet this is not what drives missions. Because if these are the major drivers of missions, how do you explain this? How do you explain the fact that Latin American Pentecostalism grew so fast in the last few decades? How do you explain the growth of African churches, especially the AICs, the African initiated churches, right? Who grew out nothing like the church that came out of Simon Kimbangu's preaching. 6 months of preaching at the church today, and 30 years in prison, and the church today's numbers close to 7 million. How to explain the Chinese revival when it resurrected out nothing? How to explain the revival movements in Indonesia in the 1960s, when 2 million, many of them nominal Muslims, turned to Christ? At best, what is listed under managerial missiology here, as listed here, provides the supportive framework for the advance of the church, at best. But oftentimes, they also play a negative role. So I'm going to give 2 examples. I'm going to have to move a bit faster. I'll just give one example. The church in China was blessed with tremendous resources from Western missions, both European and American, in the first half of the 20th century. John Sung, the great Chinese evangelist, came back in 1927 after his PhD studies. He comes back, God had told him to come and preach the gospel. He says, how come the church is not growing, God? 120 years of missionary work. The West has brought the best schools, best orphanages, best universities, best hospitals, and churches still not growing. And God said, you know what's the problem? The problem is that the missionaries brought all these things, they want to keep control. They don't trust the Chinese to be in charge. You know, that's one problem. The other problem is the Chinese church leaders. They're always looking to missionaries for their salaries. They don't look to me. Basically, both of them were looking at the human resources, right? Whatever the West was able to bring, and trusting that to grow a church, and that did not happen. Those of you who have read John Sung's biographies or diaries will know this. Around towards the end of his ministry, he wrote this. And it's also written by one of his missionary friends. And that's found in the biography. He said, God has shown me that great revival is coming to China. But first, all the missionaries must leave. He said this about 1940. Who will believe Johnson? All the missionaries must leave, then only a great revival will come. Johnson died in 1944. The communists took over in 1949. By 52, 53, almost every missionary had to leave. For the next 20 years, everybody thought that the church had died. You can read this. And then in the 70s, we begin to hear of the rumblings of one of the greatest revivals in human history. So what are we saying? The resources that have been brought in, the human resources, have actually not helped church growth. In fact, it has been a big hindrance. You know, I don't know whether there are any Indian friends here sitting here, but those of you who are in India, you know this, that the Western missionaries brought exactly the same amount of resources to India. And the church still have it. But as all of you know, in India, the churches have all this property, all these schools, all the colleges, all these hospitals. They are not the churches that are growing. It's the grassroots Pentecostal churches are growing. And those proper churches are having all this property. I'm told that the bishop spends half their time having a fight in the law courts over property issues. I think the most important comment on this actually comes from Brian Stanley's book. And I wanted to show it to you so that you can actually see it for yourself. So he was looking at Edinburgh 1910. He said Edinburgh Conference was a superbly organized and high-minded attempt to present and analyze scientifically what appeared to be the best Western minds of the day, to be the observably facts of mission expansion and policy. As an appeal to Protestant Christians to subordinate their denominational and national differences to prayerfully and thoughtfully conceive renewed commitment to the task of world mission, it was remarkably successful. Yet it managed to combine its moments of profound and bold insights with some fundamental misreading of the science of the future of Christianity. The measure of missionary success enjoyed by Christianity in the century that followed, the last 110 years now, arguably owe rather little to the priorities set and the objective enunciated at Edinburgh. The Christian faith was indeed to be transfigured over the next century, but not in a way or through the mechanism that they imagined. The most effective instrument of the transfiguration would be a non-Western mission, would not be Western mission agencies or institutions of any kind, but rather a great and sometimes unorthodox miscellany of indigenous pastors, catechists, and evangelists, men and women who had little or no access to the metropolitan mission headquarters and the wealth of the dollars and pounds which kept the missionary society machinery turning. They professed instead to rely on the simple transforming power of the Spirit and the Word. Now, you all can read this for yourself. This is on page 17 of Brian Stanley's book, the last paragraph of his opening chapter. I was shocked when I read it because I didn't expect to read it there, because it confirmed exactly what some of us have been saying all the while. Let me just sum up. If we prioritize, come back to the whole question of paradigm, I say, if we prioritize the question of seeing Cape Town as a powerful symbol of the triumph of evangelical Christianity over an anemic and dying liberalism in the West, right? Then we will continue to do exactly the same thing as we have been doing. But what we'll do is that we'll be making the same mistake as Edinburgh made. Edinburgh made two mistakes. One, they failed to see the threat of liberal theology from Germany and the social gospel, right? We can fail to see the threat of the pressure of secularism and post-modernity and all the and all the attacks against truth by modernity and postmodernity, especially in the West, we can fail to see that, and think that Western evangelicalism is the answer. The second thing that Edinburgh failed to see was that they thought the human methods would solve the problem. We can do exactly the same thing. And there are indications over in the modern mission movement, including missionaries sent from Asia, from Brazil, from Africa. They are following exactly in this way of thinking. But if we do that, we will be making the same mistakes, exactly same mistakes as Edinburgh 1910. I want to suggest that we need to rethink. Can we instead celebrate Cape Town as base and let paradigm 1 be the controlling paradigm? It's a celebration of growth of global evangelical church by the grace of God over the past 100 years. And a challenge for us to seek the Lord further for his leading as we move in the future, recognizing that it's so easy to make the mistakes of the past. If that's a choice we make, then I want to suggest that there are a few things that we need to do. The first is this, on Western Christianity. We need to carefully re-examine what the strengths and weaknesses of the prevailing Western paradigms that's driven missions in the past 100 years. What is good ought to be retained, what is not of the word and spirit need to be jettisoned. How can we recover some of the great spiritual strengths that mark Western evangelicalism in the past, and which has been sorely lost in more recent years? What and how can Western churches today learn from Christianity in the majority world? Secondly, for those of us who come from majority world, what are issues and concerns in the different parts of the majority world that must be taken up? What lessons can we together learn about how and what the Spirit is doing in the world today to bring people to faith? The danger here is those who are, especially Pentecostals, and those who are powerfully exercising a ministry in the power of the Holy Spirit, we think that we are the new messiahs. How can we live and minister in such a manner that the signs and wonders of the Holy Spirit will not lead to triumphalism and pride, but will be channeled to advance the kingdom in power through holy living and prayerfulness? And how can the churches in the majority world develop clear and mature identities of their own in their respective contexts, so that we can become an Indian Christian and still remain Indian? We can be a Brazilian Christian and still remain an African Christian and still remain African. Thirdly, what does bipolar mission mean? In the past, it was west to the rest, but now it is everywhere to everywhere. Much of Christian mission in the past few centuries have assumed and be carried out by Christendom from a Christendom perspective, wherein the rich goes to the poor, and from the center, the political, ecclesiastical, and financial to the margins. But that's exactly the reverse of what mission in New Testament of the early and in the early church. And that is not what usually happens. And that is not what usually has happened in the past 100 years. For example, in Latin America, Pentecostal revivals and growth among the poor is now moving back to the center to change the social landscape of Latin America. See David Martin's writing. Or the Back to Jerusalem movement vision of some of the Chinese house church leaders requires them to bring the gospel back along the old Silk Road with minimal human resources. No support whatsoever, they just go in faith. How do we rethink and do missions from a margin to the center? I would add this, hope nobody gets one. This includes the question of how do economically poor churches in the majority world seriously think about the re-evangelization of the West. This is very different from successful Christian leaders in the majority world migrating to the West and taking up lucrative and well-paid positions there. D, building strong partnerships. How do we build strong partnerships of genuine mutuality between the West and the majority world, which despite all the talk is still far too rare? And fifthly, How do we move away from the weakness of training in ministry and mission, oftentimes based on the assumptions of a managerial missiology? How do we move away from the weakness of training and ministry and mission, which overemphasize academic programs, to the recovery of the centrality of prayer, discipleship, and servanthood? I think evangelicals are at a crossroad. We have to make a choice, and we need to think, which way will we go? Will we repeat the mistakes of 1910 by misreading the signs of time, or will we willingly follow the Spirit's leading? I want to suggest, by closing, I think this question is directed in one sense to the West, because Western Christians need to think about that. But it's also directed to those of us from the majority world, because there's a tendency for those of us living in the majority world to think that the West is the big brother, and therefore we must always follow them. No, I think it's time for those in the majority world to say, what is God saying to us? So what I'm raising is something that is directed to both sides, both the West and the majority world, so that together we can move forward. Thank you for your time.
Great, thank you, Hwa Yung. Just to, again, remind everyone in terms of comments and questions, at the bottom of your Zoom page, there's a button called Reactions. And please click on that and then click up Raise Hand, and then I will see you and recognize you to ask a question. Let me begin, Hwa Yung, with a question that has just always been on my heart and thought as one who's worked with Asian big brothers, right, who led me and guided me. You know, I hear what you're saying about managerial missiology and also managerial academic training, but you also noted that we've got problems in the sense that when we choose a textbook to use in a course on ministerial training in KL or Singapore or elsewhere, we often turn to a Western text. In terms of the lead, in terms of training and mission and reflection and battling with issues like secularization, globalization, and elsewhere in the majority world by majority world thinkers, what sort of academic engagement and understanding go into that? Yes, it's discipleship. Yes, it's prayer. Yes, it's the power of the Spirit. But do we jettison understanding? Is reason and thinking about these things to be let go? Because I think historically, long before the West, there has been a tradition often in Christianity to withdraw from the intellectual world. Is that what we're called for? Or if we're to engage, how is that to be done in a new paradigm, in a new world where the majority world does really lead?
I think that's an absolutely fair question. And there are a few factors impinging on this. Let me just list out some of the factors. One is you work in the majority world, and you know, they say that no chairs of theology in Cambridge, Oxford, you have a chair of theology. You have only benches in Asia. Because when you sit somewhere, you cannot sit there just there because you've got so many other jobs to do. And most of us find it very difficult to find time to write. That's one problem. The second problem is this, and here I'm sorry if I hope I hurt nobody here because some of my friends. One of the problems is that in much of Asia and Africa, the top minds, being a pastor is not a very prestigious thing. If you have a son or a daughter who is a brilliant scholar, you never expect him, want him to go to study theology. You want to become a doctor, an engineer, a scientist, a top civil servant. And so you find that there's, on the average, I'm not saying there's no brilliant minds going into theology. People like Harvard U is absolutely brilliant, for example, in Hong Kong, right? But on the average, the people who move into theology are not the first class honors graduate. On the average, they are the second class, many of them. And I meant no offense to anybody here, but I'm just describing a reality in Africa because salaries are no good. I can tell you honestly, I know what it means to live 40 over years with not very good salaries. So people don't want to do it. So that's a problem because you need bright minds to do right. So that's another battle that we fight. But having said this, we need to find every possible means to overcome this. So we need to try to encourage right people going to ministry. We need to continue to let people know that in the in a battle for the mind, the writing of theology is important. Some of our churches are also spiritually minded and so westernized in their thinking that they cannot think beyond what they see. A good example is I was told that in one Singapore church, I work there, you know what I'm talking about. Singapore is the most westernized society in Asia city. Once somebody said, I want to go and do a PhD in Islamics. This is a pastor trying to become a more effective minister, theologian. The church said, no, we won't support you. You want to do Islamics. You can study theology. You can study New Testament studies, Old Testament studies, church history, because Islam is not theology. Now, with that sort of mindset, you're in real trouble. When Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism are major forces that we are dealing with. The early church, I keep reminding people, the early church fathers were able to communicate effectively with the philosophers because they had mastered pagan philosophy. And so we need to turn our churches around. And that's another big issue. I got no easy answer to that beyond pointing out that, but I want to say one thing, final thing is, I think John Stott through the Langham literature and now under Chris Wright have been doing an excellent piece of work, encouraging publishing from a majority work. And I think, and Regnum is also doing that. I got my book published, Mangoes of Bernard, through Regnum. And I think that is what's needed. We need to find ways to encourage writing and publishing.
Yeah. Good. Do I see any hands here? Anyone who wants to make a comment? Oh, Al, yes. Let's hear from Latin America.
How interesting and how pertinent what my brother Dr. Yung was saying. From Latin America, of course, we have participated with Latin American theology in Lausanne and in various conferences through people, of course, like René Padilla. And of course, I think there is a movement here. But again, as I do a PhD from Latin America on Pentecostal studies, I realize how little some of the local theologians, I might mention people like Bernardo Campos and others, are just not known at all in the West, not even in places like OCMS. Now, so the interchange through the kind of OCMS programs with doctorates and having supervisors from the majority world is a great, great blessing, a great advance. And I'm so enjoying being a kind of a bridge between some of these theologians. And I just give an example, and you can comment on this. For instance, what you rightly were mentioning about Padilla's, the late brother Padilla, who's now in heaven, of course, was saying the divide between evangelism and social commitment and service, produced a lot of theological activity here in Chile, in Latin America. And one brilliant piece of work by someone called, I don't know if you would even know him, but Revolución y Providencia y Revolución, Providence and Revolution, where he took this whole theme. Pedro Arana, very, very good theologian, and actually solved it. Because he was saying, God at work in the world and the church, as you were mentioning. He said, yes, God is at work in the world through providence. And then he goes on to say, and of course, salvation through the church. And he actually did a very, very good theological synthesis, and possibly even, I think, really actually directed himself at that little diagram you're making about God at work through the world and the church, or the church and the world. And he actually brought those two together. And that came directly out of Latin American thinking, because we face here the evangelical problem of the gospel in a society that's particularly revolutionary, was and is becoming again. So just comment on that, if you would, Dr. Yung. I don't know if you knew Pedro Arana, but he was a friend of René Padilla, Samuel Escobar, and others.
Yeah, I'm a bit familiar with I don't know Latin America that very well, but I'm a little bit familiar with some of the revolutionary tendencies, having read a bit about liberation theology.
Yeah.
I really cannot comment much on what you asked, beyond the fact that I think we got to be, my only problem with liberation theology was they talk about using the Bible as a source of theology, but actually in the end they make the revolution the primary source, and they interpret everything largely through a leftist hermeneutics. So I only hope that your friend, that whoever you are talking about, would not do the same. I think it is right that we need to wrestle with those ideas. One of the big issues that I've wrestled with in my country is the question of nation building. We don't talk about revolution here, because if we talk about revolution here, we end up in prison. Whereas in Latin America, you can talk about revolution without ending up in prison. But we want to talk about nation building. So I think we need to wrestle with issues, and we mustn't. For example, a simple example is that many of my Christian friends just assume, how come the country is not democratic? How come there's no human rights? And what they don't realize is that they are bringing a Western concept of what a nation should be into Malaysia, where the majority of people are Muslims. And why should Muslims accept a Western Christian concept? So unless we wrestle with that and begin to communicate, find a way to communicate with Muslims and help them to also, because many of them are also concerned about human rights, many of them are also concerned about democracy, but they don't want a Christian framework. So how do I in Malaysia communicate with Muslim and talk about mutual concerns, looking at issues like human rights and the nation building, about democracy, but a way that both of us can look at together happily? And I think that's the sort of thing I suspect what you are talking about is, how can we work together to develop theologies that can speak to our own people.
That's right.
So
and I just want to say that these guys, the gang, were replying to liberation theology from an evangelical point of view. And I'm just underlining OCMS's great value, because we are bringing together these national theologies with the West. And OCMS does uplift us trying to do theology in the majority world.
Well, are you writing a thesis on that?
Yes, I'm writing a thesis on Pentecostalism.
Sorry?
My thesis is on the beginnings of Pentecostalism in 1909, only 3 years after Azusa here in Chile, and the theology that emerges, that has never been written, but I wish to write it.
Okay, let's go to Marina. Go ahead, Marina.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. You made your points very clear. And last week, Wansuk was speaking about the split between the evangelicals and the ecumenicals, and then the convergences between them and the role OCMS played in the convergence processes. And I surprised him with the question about what he thought the understanding of sin played a role in the holistic mission concepts which formed OCMS. You showed clearly that the fear of the Lausanne movement was that the ecumenicals of the WCC had given up the faith in the uniqueness of Christ and his saving grace. And the ecumenicals were arguing that the economic and political situation was marked by structural sin, which enslaved the people, and true salvation cannot be attained when only the saving of or winning of soul was dealt with and given importance, without actually looking at the sinful situation and not trying to change that. I was wondering how the holistic understanding of mission, which speaks about the saving grace and the need for transformation, deals with this conflicting understanding of sin. That's my first question. And the second one, which is slightly different, is you posed a question whether Cape Town repeated the mistake of Edinburgh 2010. I remember some criticism that Cape Town was driven by North Americans, and you quoted some of these critics like the market mentality. Now, in hindsight, one of the problems of Edinburgh 1910 was that organizations from outside the so-called mission fields attempted to develop a strategy on how to evangelize the whole world. In how far do you think Cape Town had a similar approach in strategizing? in how far were people in the majority world involved in defining what the gospel means to them, in theologizing, and how evangelism can be done? So I have this two set of questions.
I'm not sure I understand your second question, but let me address your first question first. I think your first question focused on the doctrine of sin, right? And I think evangelicals have always taken to take a very spiritualized understanding of the doctrine of sin. And so sin is my broken relationship with God. Okay. The ecumenicals took a very horizontal view of sin. My broken relationship with my neighbor, with the environment, between nations. I always actually I found when I was growing up, I found Francis Schaeffer very useful. I don't know whether you've ever read him, but he talks about the fact that sin came to the world, broke our right. That was our first major alienation was between a broken relationship between man and God, between human and God. But the result of our broken relationship between the human and God meant the broken relationship between the human and the fellow human beings, our social political problems. It also meant our broken relationship with ecology, our environmental problems. It also meant our broken relationship with ourselves, right? Our psychological, emotional problems. Salvation, and I tell my students, I teach my systematic theology class, is when a person comes to know Jesus Christ, the salvation, the healing, the salvation of Christ does not only reaches out to him spiritually, but it must have necessarily other consequences, right? Because sin leads to other consequences, social, political, ecological to psychological. Salvation must necessarily touch all these aspects. And so the way Francis Schaeffer puts it in his books is very, very neat. He says, all these areas, yes, salvation, to know Christ is to know salvation, to be spiritually saved. We can be sure of our eternal destiny. But there must also be, he used the term, substantial healing in all these other areas. And I think if we begin to look at that point of view, then we don't have to think about dichotomizing spiritual salvation with salvation as social or political, etc. So that's my response to your first question. All right, I hope that answers it. Now, you need to be a bit clearer on the second question. I'm sorry, I need to push you on that.
Yes, I think I should apologize myself. I was so distracted. There is this postman, somebody delivering something, and he kept knocking at the window. So I was so distracted with it. So let me just, sorry.
Right, no problems.
Yeah. So my second question was, you posed a question about, like whether Cape Town repeated the mistake of Edinburgh 2010. And
1910.
Yes, 1910, sorry. And I remember some criticism that Cape Town was driven by the Americans, and you quote some of this critic, like the market mentality. And so now I am talking about Edinburgh, that in hindsight, one of the problems of Edinburgh 1910 that we see was that organizations from outside the so-called mission field attempted to develop a strategy on how to evangelize the world. So it was the organization outside the mission field who were strategizing on how to evangelize the whole world. So in how far do you think Cape Town had a similar approach in strategizing? In how far were people in the majority world involved in defining what the gospel means to them and in theologizing, and how evangelism can be done? So how far were the people in the majority world involved in all these processes in the Cape Town movement?
First, I stand corrected, but I don't follow your argument that 1910 there were outside organizations coming to bring about strategy. I'm not sure that actually took place. It was done by the commissions, and all of them were either theologians or those involved in missions. So I think it was the missionary thinkers that were actually thinking like the typical the world outside, that you do this strategy, you solve the problem. So I stand corrected. You might be right because I don't know. I'm not expert in this area. All right. But coming back to your main question, however, is this: to what extent is the majority world Christians involved in the theology of Cape Town? My first point is that Cape Town had many things. So to say that there was a theology of Cape Town is difficult, right? Beyond the fact that the best summary we can find is a Cape Town commitment, all right? Now, and I must say that there's a confession here. I was part of the 5-member leadership team, but my focus was on the participant selection. And Doug told me, he says, you must, so I say, I want to make sure that there's the church as it is in the world today is represented. And he said, okay, we go ahead. So that's why 65% people ended up there. But I wasn't primarily concerned dealing with the program. There were aspects of the program which I'm not comfortable with, right? To begin with, if you look carefully at the speakers, you find there was still a slight predominance of Western speakers over people from majority world. I wish that there was 65% speakers from the majority world. That's my first comment. My second comment is there was some areas that I think a lot of things, I think because there was a predominance, there was a slight predominance of speakers from the Western world, much of the Cape Town program was still shaped like typical Western conference. Much of it, okay? And from that point of view, I do have some reservations, but again, we can't do everything. So my response to you would be, I think to the extent that the Cape Town commitment was drawn up by a committee, not of people from the West, but it was drawn up by an international committee. People like Carver Yu was involved. People like, there were Africans involved. There were other people involved. It was the result of 2 years' work done beforehand. That's why I was surprised that it should have been given to people to discuss right at the beginning of the conference, but that it was only handed out the night before. So that was disappointing because the work that's been building up to it was 2 years in advance, right? So, but I do want to assure you that that work was done by people that represented the whole global church. Now, whether it fully expresses the mind of those in the majority world, I think history will judge. But already you notice from my comments that there are certain things about the program which I felt that the majority world's concerns were not fully dealt with. But I can only say that that's going to be an ongoing discussion and we need to push it. And people like you in OCMS can help to advance the discussion.
Let's take a final question.
Just one sentence, not a question. I just wanted to explain and clarify what I meant by Edinburgh 1910 being accused. I mean, like on hindsight, being a strategy, being mainly dominated by Westerners or people from outside the majority world, was in the sense to just say that it was the missionaries who were working in the mission field, perhaps, who were setting the agenda for the work, and not the people in the mission field. That was what I meant. Yes.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the clarification.
We'll take one last question from Damon. So you're muted, Damon.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for your lecture, giving us a brief history of Christianity in the recent 100 years or more. So while I was listening to your lectures, I see many kind of dichotomies between two sides. So the term biblical holism came to my mind at the end of the talk. And I think it will benefit us if we, in the end, in the coming century, that if Christians can look at one another as one people and not in a dichotomous way, and so that we can have unity and diversity together. I list some of the dichotomies that's there, like social concern and proclamation, liberal and evangelicals, the West and the majority world, managerial missiology and spirit-filled missiology. So those things seem to be often against one another, but sometimes those things can come together. I think Wong Suk in last week's lecture talks about how the liberal and the evangelical are slowly coming together. Like OCMS, we are for holistic mission. We have PhD thesis on social concerns. We have thesis on biblical study, proclamation. So we can actually learn from one another. You know, we can learn from the liberal because they have, to be honest, they're a little bit far ahead of us in terms of social involvement, even though they suffer on the side of proclamation. But by the grace of God, you know, our founders like Padilla and you know, we catch up and move in a holistic, integrated way. So we can come close together, and the West and the majority world can come close together because we know that the churches in the majority worlds are growing, but we need that. But I see a lot of problem in those churches as well because we don't know how to organize our church because we have such a short history. So we are lacking in training, in academics, administration, and we lack money as well. But the West have all this, you know, they have hundreds of years of experience in, like the Anglican Church. They have a system to run the church. Okay, they have other problems, but we can learn from them. We in the Chinese church have a lot to catch up in terms of, I don't know, church leadership. You know, we are falling behind. So we can learn from, and they can learn from us. Like, you know, they can really learn from the Christian in China. This very spirit-filled Christians. They believe in spiritual power, supernatural power, you know, everything. So there can be a kind of coming together and learning from one another, which you helpfully mentioned. You did say that we need to learn from one another. And I think that posture will be more helpful to God's kingdom in the coming century if we do not see one another as opposing one another, but as in the body of Christ, complementing one another, unity in diversity. So it's not me and against them, or majority were against the West. So we're actually one together. We are gifted in different ways. The West has been gifted by this long history of Christianity, and the majority, well, we have not been blessed with that long history, but we can learn from one another. The West can learn from the spontaneity from the majority world, but also we can also learn from their structure. So I think we need to be learn to see how we see one another, not in any dualistic way, but what I call a biblical holism, that we hold together and we learn from one another in a spirit of humility, and that we can have unity and diversity. You know where I'm coming from, because I'm a Trinitarian theologian, that unity and diversity coming together. But your lecture, thank you for, has really prompted me to think in this way. I mean, it's such a good summary that it really make me think, oh, why so many dichotomies? So I want to say thank you to you.
Well, I don't think I need to respond to that one, right? But the only thing is that since you're a Trinitarian theologian, the Trinity are not three different gods. There's a God who's unity.
Yeah.
Now the Trinity has a unifying center.
Yeah.
And I think even when we talk about whether we are talking about dichotomies, whether you're talking about social concerns or evangelism, the West or the majority world, there has got to be a unifying center. And without the unifying center, precisely building on your Trinitarian theology.
Yeah, but I mean, OCMS has been driving this holism in the last few decades, thanks to your work and other founders. We've been driving this sense of holism together. And I think we must hold on to that. Biblical holism, not any kind of holism, but biblical holism.
Well, thank you, Hwa Yung, and again, an excellent presentation. And once again, we're dealing with these difficult areas that have developed in 20th century theology and mission going forward. Next week, we have Ruth Padilla DeBoer. So we're going to be more than 65% on the right side in this series of lectures. So, I think we're just about 100% with the majority world on this. But again, this is a very important chapter. And again, it fills in some of this background and history that surrounds this. I know there's a lot of differences of opinion on these things, but again, what a great contribution. Thank you all for joining, and hope to see you next week when Ruth, who's always interesting as a speaker, will be our next contributor. So have a lovely day. Again, this will be recorded and is available on YouTube. So if you want to go back over the points, you may do so. Hwa Yung, as always, blessings, and we will communicate further as we suggested. So
thank you very much. God bless. Right.